For me, it's been my long-held dream. I mean, really, since I was about 16 years old, to do an entire film on IMAX.
IMAX was founded in 1967. For decades, the format was the preserve of documentaries and experiential short films. The first attempt to embrace narrative storytelling was Fantasia 2000, which, however, suffered from the technical limitations of a format originally designed for 35mm. The films we typically watch in cinemas use 35mm film, which runs vertically through the camera with each frame occupying the space of 4 perforations. IMAX, on the other hand, utilizes 65mm film that runs horizontally, allowing for a much larger frame that spans 15 perforations. This is the celebrated format known as 15/70mm.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Each reel has a runtime of only 3 minutes. The result? A production where, while 10 setups a day are the norm for a standard film, with IMAX doing 3 or 4 means moving at the speed of light.
The thing that was stopping us was always the sound.
Because the cameras themselves are very loud. You know, they're taking a very large amount of film, 65mm film, running at 15 perforations per frame. This film has to transport through the camera very, very fast. It creates an enormous amount of noise. We would always use it for action scenes because noise wasn't really a factor. We were building the soundtrack afterwards, but for dialogue scenes, that made it impossible.
We had gone to IMAX and sort of challenged them to create new cameras that were quiet, or at the very least, create a blimp that would baffle the noise of the camera.
We invented this very, very high-tech system, this box that you put the camera into, allowed us to, photograph these guys in close-up and record their dialogue and get their performance as they were doing it.
The immense bulk of the camera, protected by the soundproofing system, created a physical barrier that hindered the filming of intimate close-up dialogue.
With a mirror system, where you have the lens of the camera, we put a half-silvered mirror across it, and then another mirror on an arm that arms out, so the actor can be further away and they can see each other right next to the lens, and they're making eye contact and they can perform together. That meant we could do the whole film on IMAX for the first time. Back in 2007 with The Dark Knight, when we were planning that film, I approached IMAX. We talked about using their cameras to shoot the action scenes, the key action scenes of that movie. And we did that very successfully. We were thrilled with the way it worked. Over the years, we've tried to incorporate IMAX technology more and more through the films I've made, from films like Dunkirk and Interstellar, and indeed Oppenheimer. But what we'd never been able to do before was to shoot the entire film that way. Once the IMAX film leaves the set, we take it straight to the lab, and it gets run through the processor, through the developer and fixer, goes through the drying process. And then at the end of production, we go into the edit suite. We take those rolls of film that have been digitized for us, we edit digitally. And then when the cut is finished, we get a list of numbers out of the computer that correspond with numbers on the edge of the film that we shot. We send that to the lab. They cut the negative physically. They glue it together. And then that is printed with the appropriate color corrections onto a positive print, and those positive prints will play in IMAX theaters directly.
With Odissea, Nolan breaks the final barrier. For the first time in the history of wide-release cinema, an entire film has been shot natively in IMAX 70mm. To realize it, over 610 kilometers of film were consumed.
point. For me, the idea was to thoroughly familiarize myself with the events of the narrative in all the different ways I've seen it, including, I think my earliest exposure to the Odyssey was in primary school. I was probably 5 years old, watching the older kids put on a play where they had, the Trojan horse, and they were strapping Ulysses to the mast, hearing the sirens and that. So I think in adapting this, really the challenge was to try and include, the things that people would expect to see in an adaptation of the Odyssey. And that's really the challenge with adaptation. Can you make it for people who are very familiar with the text and for people who are really coming to it fresh? Because ideally you've got to please both.